Hi. Right. First, I'm going to tell you about how I started my women's team and why. Then I'll talk a bit about how things are for junior cyclists and then where we are now. I started bike racing in my late 20s. I'd always been sporty and trained in a gym, lifting weights for most of my adult life. I was also a trained dancer. I happened to see a men's bike race and I asked if women could do it. I didn't even realise that women could race bikes. I went and I bought myself a cheap, heavy bike from Halfords. I got myself a race licence and I entered my first race. On the start line, I realised I was lining up against elite riders. I was a complete novice. By the time I had my feet clipped in the pedals, they were gone. Let me explain how cycling works. If a man decides he wants to enter a race, he gets himself a race licence and he enters a 4th category race. All of the men in that race are novice and the field is fair. This allows new racers to come into the sport and gives them races where they can learn the skills and tactics of bike racing. If he wins, he earns points, which then take him to a 3rd category and then a 2nd cat, first, and if very talented, elite. As a female, there is no such progression. Everyone is in one race together, from novice to elite. Not only is this very unfair, it's also dangerous. Bike racing is a dangerous sport where you are all grouped tightly together, touching shoulders at speeds in excess of 25 miles an hour. You need to know what you're doing. In my first year of racing, I lined up alongside world and Olympic champions. I never saw any new women enter the sport, and to be fair, why would they? Elite women could race with the lower categories of men. Not the 4th cat, as everyone knows that those races are full of crashes, but they could ride with the Cat 2 men if they chose to. They wouldn't win these races, but they could stay in them. For any other women, it was pretty dispiriting. I couldn't understand how more women would ever come into this sport with the system the way it was, and it became obvious to me that individuals would have to take it up themselves. The races relied on a network of organisers who volunteered for British cycling and ran races for men. All of the organisers were men. There were very few women involved and no women on regional boards. It was basically an old boys' club, and whenever I tried to persuade them to put on a women's race alongside their men's event, the answer would always be the same. Women do not want to race. But I knew they were wrong. I wanted to race, so there must be others. There were so many barriers. The organisers just didn't care about women's racing. Often, a woman would pay to enter an advertised women's race and then be told on the start line that they're being put in with the 4th category men. We got the message loud and clear. We were an afterthought. We were not important. So I decided to set up my own race team. I'd been travelling to races alone and it was not a welcoming environment. I thought if I set up a race team, I could find other women that also wanted to race and we could support each other. If other women saw a team of friendly racers, it would encourage more to have a go. I persuaded the organisers they needed to put on more women's races and split up the categories. I told them they couldn't keep putting women in with the men, otherwise they would never encourage more women to race. It doesn't matter how many women you have on the start line. Keep the races separate and eventually more women will have a go. In 2014, I finally managed to set up the first Yorkshire Women's Road Race Series. These were a series of road races for category 2, 3 and 4 women, so no elites. Full open roads with rolling traffic closures, just like the men had. In that first year, we held 6 events and had full fields of 50 women in each, the majority of who were new to racing. The year after that, I convinced the region to hold a separate women's championships, the first region to do so. This was 3 years after the 2012 Olympics, where a Yorkshire girl, Lizzie Armitstead, who'd somehow managed to make her own way into the world of professional cycling, fought the most amazing battle with Marianne Vos in torrential rain to take the silver medal in the road race. That race was watched by more viewers than the men's road race. And while Lizzie inspired a nation, we were still fighting just to even hold a women's race. I'm now going to talk about the youth and junior girls and the difficulties they face. I soon realised that the situation was just as bad for junior girls. At youth level, under 16, girls were racing. The parents are still very much involved at that age, and the riders have the support from cycling clubs as well as their parents. Sometimes the girls would race in with the boys and maybe have a separate girls' prize. However, the drop-off rate from these youth girls when they hit the junior age of 16 was huge. We were losing so many of our talented girls. When a youth boy moves up to junior category, he has a full series of races to aim for. These include very prestigious races, which are well known for developing the next generation of cyclists. They also have their own junior national championships. The girls had nothing, absolutely nothing. They could choose to either race with the junior boys, which they would never do, as they would be so out of their depth now that these boys had developed, or their other option was to move straight into the elite women's category. This was deemed better than trying to compete against junior boys. There was no support, no funding. They would have to do this alone and travel to races around the country to race against the UK's best women. They had gone from doing 30-minute races on closed circuits to open road races of 60 miles plus. There was no progression for them. It was all or nothing. So I started by taking on as many youth and junior riders as I could, and I offered them support, and long story short, I started all the same battles again. In 2017, a full 5 years after those Olympic Games that were supposed to inspire young people, we finally got a junior women's championship. In just 2 years, the fields are full, and the talent coming through from the UK is exceptional. Nearly all of my first intake of youth riders stayed in the sport, and they are now on the senior GB squad heading for the World Championships this year. They will be our future Olympians. So, where are we now? The junior scene is growing, which is positive, but there are still lots of barriers to teenage girls competing. In 2009, there were 305 youth girls with racing licences in the UK, but at junior, only 67. Now, 10 years later, there are 852 youth girls, but still only 235 junior girls are racing this year in the UK. It is increasing, but it still shows the drop-off rate and the barriers stopping girls from continuing with their sport once they reach 16. The funding is difficult, and as we all know, girls can't be what they can't see, and it's hard for us to raise sponsorship without coverage. Media and television are showing a small amount of women's racing, but there is still that view that people won't watch. I'm pretty sick of this argument around women's sport, as I find it's easily disproved. I'm sure people said the same of the Lionesses before they showed the World Cup, and we know how many people just watched that. So let's talk about the money. Sponsorship for women's teams is hard to come by. We train just as hard as the men, if not harder, as the women have to hold down a second job as well as perform at that elite level. The men are paid. I would love to be able to give my girls a wage, but to be honest, just expenses would be nice. In 2019, men still run cycling. For a number of years, I was the only female in the managers' meetings at European races, and it was pretty standard to have the male managers look me up and down and smirk at me, like it was so amusing to them that I was mixing in their game. Just last week, I was in the pits at a national series race, which I'm very proud to say my team are leading. I had all the girls' spare bikes and wheels set up in the pits area, as there are no laps out allowed, so it's imperative they get fixed as soon as possible if they have a mechanical. Before the women's race was even halfway through, we had the staff of all the men's teams pushing their way into the area with their numerous spare bikes and commandeering the space. Make way. Here comes the main event. They still believe we are there as a warm-up act, and it shows. Cycling Weekly is probably the most read magazine in the UK cycling scene. I stopped buying it a few years ago as they never bothered reporting on women's racing. The last time I bought it, they were still advertising a Christmas calendar of young female sports people in varying states of undress. Imagine then how I felt when this year they gave a double-page spread to Rachel McKinnon. Young female cyclists read that magazine, and here they were being told, not only is it fair for trans women to compete against them, but also with no intervention whatsoever. No testosterone lowering, just simply self-ID, and if they disagree, they are the ones in the wrong. They are denying someone their human right. It may be a human right to participate in sports, but it's not a human right to identify into whichever category you wish. With such a lack of respect for women's sport in general, it's not hard to see how it could be easy for these people to advocate or turn a blind eye to opening up female sport to biological males. They don't give it much thought, it's not important to them, and it doesn't affect the men. They don't believe women's sport is important enough to protect, but I know it is. I know that women do not want to compete and won't compete in a field they believe is unfair. I've fought pretty hard to get where we are today, and there is hope in the future of women's cycling. We don't need another barrier. We've finally got proper, safe, competitive categories for racing for women and girls. And now we could lose it all, and we can't let that happen. Thank you.